Hello everyone, this is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx. Today I want to do a presentation on an essay that Eddie and I did on a Marxist interpretation of the pink tide, the new socialist tide in Latin America, where we analyze what were the failures of the first pink tide that led to a conservative backlash and how can we prevent those. So it's a critique or an analysis from a point of solidarity. We're not just critiquing socialist states. We're trying to do so from a critique from the people, as one of my good friends once hinted to, a solidarity critique, in hopes of perhaps having those critiques internalized and used in such a way so that this new wave of socialism doesn't end up in another conservative backlash. So today we are in the midst of the emergence of a new wave of socialism across Latin America. In the last couple of years, we have witnessed the return to power of the movement towards socialism party in Bolivia via Luis Arce's electoral victory, the victory of Peru Libre, a Marxist-Leninist and Mariateguist party guided by the rural school teacher Pedro Castillo. We've also witnessed constant revolts against the neoliberal puppet in Colombia, the government of Iván Duque. We have seen the expunging of the fabricated charges of corruption against Lula da Silva, making him eligible to run again in 2022. He was ahead in all polls before he was falsely accused of corruption in 2018, and more. The region, which has been the historical victim of European colonialism, imperialism, and the breadths of its modern forms via the US, now finds itself, once again, actuating the Herculean task of rejecting submission to the largest empire in human history and affirming its struggle for an autonomous, socialist, and internationalist existence. In the complexity of this context, a Marxist reflection on the failures of the first pink tide and how to prevent their recurrence in the current one is of grave importance. The typology of the pink tide. The beginning of the 21st century in Latin America was marked by a crumbling neoliberal capitalism, and the upsurge of a series of socialist and left-wing governments subsequently known as the pink tide. This pink tide, initiated with the 1998 election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, was not homogeneous. Corresponding to their historical context and to the subsequent level of imperialist pressure, each country provided different forms and levels of resistance to neoliberalism. Typically, theorization of the pink tide has noticed a split between those governments which had reformist and those which had revolutionary aims. The late Marta Harnecker, former student of Althusser, decades-long active participant in the Cuban revolutionary process, and leading Chavista of 21st century socialism, drew a tripartite typology of the governmental situation in Latin America in her 2015 text, A World to Build, New Paths Towards 21st Century Socialism. Harnecker states that there are 1, those governments which wish to give neoliberalism a makeover. She includes Colombia, Mexico, Chile, etc. 2, those which sustain neoliberal policies but emphasize social issues. Here she includes Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. And 3, those governments which seek to break with neoliberalism and support popular mobilizations, of which she includes Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and of course, Venezuela. Harnecker found that the latter group, more radical in nature, grew out of movements based on large coalitions where decentralized democratic communes grounded on the historical presence of Amerindian communal socialism were considered the fundamental building blocks for the development of socialism. This socialism appears, as Mariategui once emphasized, not as a carbon copy of the socialism that arose in other continents, but as a unique, heroic creation of the traditional communistic spirit of the region's indigenous traditions. In embracing these traditional regional characteristics, it sought to distinguish itself from the forms of socialism that arose in the previous century. A similar typology is present in William Robinson's 2008 Latin America and Global Capitalism, where a distinction in the pink tide is made between those progressive reformist governments seeking maldistributive programs but no threat to the existing property relations. He categorizes Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Nicaragua in this group, and the radical ones, seeking the transformation in class, structural, and international relations, of which he sees Venezuela and Bolivia in this group. For Robinson, there was also a century-unique difference to these new left-wing projects. In contrast to the socialist projects of the 20th century, these new experiments grew out of grassroots movements centered around community organizing as opposed to economic organizing, came to power through democratic electoral activity as opposed to doing so through guerrilla warfare or other means outside of bourgeois institutions, and largely sustained the existing liberal democratic bourgeois state as opposed to establishing a proletarian state. With the exception of their difference concerning the categorization of Nicaragua, where Harnacker sees it as radical, Robinson as reformist, the Harnacker-Robinson typology of Latin America falls in line with the dichotomy of this left proposed by anti-communist Mexican Foreign Minister Jorge Castañeda, who is cited by both, who saw a central distinction between the good left, which he saw as the mild reformist one, and the bad left, which he saw as the radical or revolutionary one. In considering that Robinson's text is at the beginning of the pink tide, given that the last countries had just taken power, and Harnacker's right at the end, right before the conservative backlash, we can observe a certain typological uniformity throughout the first pink tide, marked by this distinction between radical and reformist tendencies. The conservative backlash and its lessons moving forward. Shortly after the publication of Harnacker's text, a conservative turn would take place in many of the previous pink tide countries. Brazil saw the emergence of Michel Temer after the illegitimate US-backed impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. This, along with the imprisonment of Lula, was a precondition for the 2018 electoral victory of Jair Bolsonaro and neo-fascism in Brazil. Along with this, we have Peronist Cristina Fernandez's loss in Argentina in 2015, the loss of socialist President Michelle Bachelet in Chile in 2018, the turn towards neoliberalism of Lenin Moreno in 2018, the US-backed coup in Bolivia in 2019, and more. In all of these cases, the empire's influence was present, primarily in manufacturing and disseminating a mountain of fabricated evidence used against the incarceration of Lula and the impeachment of Dilma, as well as the bloody fascist coup in Bolivia. Although imperialism played in these losses a determining role through mechanisms like funding the opposition and its media, limiting the scope of what the left-wing government could do through alliances with national bourgeois classes, economic blockades, or outright military force or threat of it, we must still identify the errors which could have prevented these losses. We must emphasize that 1, although these government actions and errors are determined by imperialist pressure, that is, their errors exist within the historical presupposed boundaries set upon it by the internal and external pressures of American imperialism and global capitalism, nonetheless, 2, within the sphere of this pressure, only a struggle to move beyond those boundaries, that is, a struggle for the structural change necessary to make the imperialist instruments and tactics futile, can allow for a true solidification of power in the hands of a working class party. What does this mean? Well, a working class party in power is working on borrowed time if it does nothing to change the fundamental bourgeois nature of the existing state apparatuses. The liberal democratic electoral process, the legal institutions, the military, the police, in essence, the entirety of the political, legal, ideological superstructure are fundamentally bourgeois. Their seizure of power must be followed by the immediate process to shatter these apparatuses and to develop in its place genuine proletarian apparatuses whose most critically fundamental purpose is to keep power in the hands of the working class. The concerns for term limits, multi-party elections, pluralistic means of communication, etc., are all fundamental to the bourgeois problematic. They are concerns bound to a specific form of class society which excuses exploitation and plunder through vague appeals to abstract freedoms and distorted conceptions of democracy. This bourgeois sentimentalism must be progressively expelled when a workers' party grabs power. Only through this progressive abolition of bourgeois ideology and state apparatuses can a working class political victory meaningfully take up its historical role as the emancipatory agent. Socialism, as a transitory stage, must not only change the relations and aims of production, but with it must change all of the institutions and juridical structures which bourgeois society uses to reproduce itself materially and ideologically. Examples of this can be seen scattered in some of the more radical governments of the first pink tide. For instance, movements in this direction can be seen in the installment of Venezuela's 1999 Bolivarian Constitution, which is now attempting to be sublated in Hegel's sense by the 2017 Constitutional Assembly. As seen in Article 62 of the 1999 Constitution, these constitutional developments heavily emphasize the ability for the masses to have an active participation in, quote, creating, implementing, and controlling public policy as the necessary way to achieve the protagonism that ensures its full development, both individual and collective. It can be seen in Venezuela's attempts at creating new political forms of democracy, most importantly in their development of participatory and protagonistic democracy via their cultivations of communes and community councils. In the realm of education, Venezuela's 2009 organic educational law has made tremendous leaps in the building of socialist consciousness. It is not without reason that even after the full force of American imperialism has come down on Venezuela, the people have remained loyal to the Bolivarian Revolution and to the continual development of socialism. In Bolivia, the quick recovery of political power demonstrates the extraordinary achievement of the movement towards Socialism Party in winning what Gramsci called the war of position. That is, Bolivarian socialism, or Bolivian socialism, was able to create a consolidation of popular hegemony. Nonetheless, as Peruvian philosopher Sebastián León noted, a victory in the war of position does not guarantee the uninterrupted continuity of the revolution. It is also necessary to be prepared to win in the war of maneuvers, to defend by arms the transformation of society when the reactionaries make it necessary. As we know from Martin Sivak's text on Evo Morales, the Bolivian people had demanded the arming of the revolution before the coup. Sadly, this was not concretized in time. This was the same advice that Fidel told Allende in their 1971 meeting. Unfortunately, the latter also did not listen. Conclusions. Although, as Hegel said once, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk, the insights of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on the necessity of abolishing the bourgeois state and establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat have been confirmed in the practice of 20th and 21st century socialism. The examples of China, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Vietnam, etc., show that only through the progressive abolition of the bourgeois state and the subsequent development of a worker state can the working class sustain power, regardless of the harsh conditions imperialism puts it in. Furthermore, only under such an environment of secured power can the objective and subjective conditions for the possibility of communism, once the global situation is ripe, arise. Thus, it is not without wonder that the Latin American governments who have best engaged in this revolutionizing process have been the ones to most firmly sustain their position in power. Such are the examples of Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. These fundamental lessons must be internalized by the new wave of socialism in the continent. Although, as mentioned before, part of what can and cannot be done is determined by the pressure of imperialism. Within this determination, we must find the courage to push beyond these limits as much as practically and fruitfully possible. These lessons and conclusions should not be used to point the finger at our comrades and say, "You haven't done this, therefore you are an opportunist and a traitor to the revolution." Instead, our critiques must be constructive and from a place of proletarian solidarity. We must support our comrades in their struggle against imperialism, but also remind them that a proletarian party in power under bourgeois state apparatuses skates on thin ice. These lessons must not be used to delegitimize our comrades' socialist projects, for then our activity serves the US State Department in creating a left delegitimation campaign against socialist projects. Our critique must be supportive and done in appropriate comradely ambient. Only if we are conscious of such lessons will this new wave of socialism not be interrupted by a reactionary backlash once again. So, I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Carlos again from Midwestern Marx, signing out.